if it's completely immanent, if their otherness is completely immanent to themselves, these others proliferate to infinity. They are nothing but multiples of multiples of multiples of multiples and so forth. Then Parmenides goes on to argue that that doesn't make sense, right, for these, well, for very particular reasons. But what Badiou wants to get out of this moment is to say, Plato's nailed it. He's actually got contour on the table. He just doesn't have the symbolic apparatus to think it, which is why it's crucial for Badiou that Plato's Parmenides describes this as a dream. The only way one could think about this is by entering a kind of dream world. The point is, it's unimaginable. And you can, those of you who do Lacan, can see where I'm going with this, hopefully, right? This cannot fit into the imaginary. It cannot be imaged, and so forth. The only way, then, it could be handled is symbolically, and Plato does not have a symbolic apparatus. It takes contour to create a symbolic apparatus to think pure multiplicity. Did that real fast run through that make plenty of sense?
What another way of putting that is that it can't be presented, which is why it's unimaginable.
No, it can't be represented. It is presented. It can be represented. If we go back to that difference between presentation and representation.
So it can't be presentation of presentation.
No, it is a presentation of presentation. I mean, this is
what Plato is arguing is that because I can't represent it, it must not be possible to present this presentation. But the way you present presentation is through symbols, right. Mathematical symbols.
Right. So have an exponential equation, right? Infinitely approaching upon a number line, right? At infinity, you can represent it as, say, given the equation, -2, right? Because it's a limit, it's an asymptotal limit. At infinite, it reaches that point. But then the question is, can you imagine that infinity? Right? Is that something that you can picture in your head? I mean, this goes back to the Cartesian chiliagon, yeah, right? The thousand-sided image, right? Can you imagine the chiliagon, right, of a thousand-sided image? No, you can't, right? Because, or if you possibly could imagine a thousand-sided polygon, then add another 1,000 sides, and so on and so on and so on. And you reach to a certain point whereby you can no longer imagine it, right? But you can represent it, or not represent. You can present that polygon through mathematical terms of n terms, right? And the features of that polygon vis-a-vis mathematics.
So we're dealing here with something that cannot be pictured, imaged, imagined, but can be symbolized.
But it's not a virtualization either.
What do you mean?
Well, that's precisely the point, is that it can't be a virtual.
Right. I mean, like, a virtualization is an abstraction, but an abstraction is still within the realm of imaginability.
That's right.
So it has to be symbolically, which is...
A perfect example is the imaginary number, which is so marvelously named, right? I. This can't be imagined, right? It can't be imagined at all. But you can do all kinds of calculations with it as a symbol.
Right, okay.
That's the kind of thing we've got in mind.
Let me intervene just real quick. This is the very fact that it can't be an abstraction is, again, and I want to drive this point home just in case some of the people who I would imagine would be interested in Badiou are. This is why Badiou is not an idealist.
Right.
This is why he is not, engaged in reification or abstraction, because it's not the abstract which is the foundation. It's that, as he says, in the introduction, it's just the fact that people have this terror of numbers, which they ought not to have.
Right. And that's what's going to be, this is why, we'll get to this in a minute here, but this is why this is so crucial.
The name.
It's going to be pure nomination, naming of nothing but the nothing, that's going to allow us to construct all of this. Yeah. Okay.
So why is symbolizing it not representation? Why is it presentation instead of representation?
As ontology, the presentation, not presentation. It's not representation because a representation is an image in this language, an appearance.
Well, and if I can get more rigorous about it,
yeah.
A lot of mathematics can be presented, but can also be represented. So, for example, if you have
geometry,
yeah, or if you have y equals x minus 1, right?
This can be represented,
and not just visually. What's important is, okay, so take that y equals x plus 2, and this is actually a big problem in mathematics. That's consistent. And the very system that renders Cartesian algebra consistent rigorously is set theory, right? So that is simultaneously, even though it's symbolic, is simultaneously a presentation, right, but also a representation, right? And for example, we could have the set of y, which equals, you know, we could just have a long infinite set that includes all the numbers that would fit in that. But this is where, so there's nothing problematic about that being a presentation and a representation. However, now let's go to what it presents, the set theory itself.
Behind it, if you will.
That set theory itself is not representable in its axiomatic form.
Right.
It is radically inconsistent at its core. And so, but this is an important distinction. Just because it's radically inconsistent, right, and ergo uses the axiomatic system, does not mean it's not rigorous. Does that distinction make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, this is why it's so elegant in its solution, right? And it also doesn't fall into this idealism of the one where you posit some external, you know, consistent absolute that renders everything consistent. Right, and also why it fits symbolically of being pure presentation, because those axioms in set theory can be rendered symbolically, which is to say presented, even though unlike that form of mathematics, they cannot be represented.
Right, it's just not, to put it in Badiou sense.
Yeah. So the reason it's so crucial for Badiou that Plato has this recourse to the dream is because it actually sets up this very problematic. And in light of Freud and Lacan, right? I mean, you can have a lot of fun with this moment here, because it's the latent dream content is itself actually symbolic. It's not imaginable, but you render it consistent in your telling of it as you're on the analytic couch, and so you end up with an imaginary version of what was originally symbolic, a consistent version of pure inconsistency. And so, but his point in saying this is the dream itself, the latent dream content, is it's unimaginable. Be imagined. So, and this for Badiou is where Plato comes remarkably close to laying all of this out. So then he goes on to talk about Platos versus Polar.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah,
I'm still, like, for example, the two equations you gave, y equals x plus 2, but then you showed, like, the imaginary number, the square root of -1. I'm not really getting the difference between presentation. I get the difference between consistency and inconsistency, but in terms of like symbolizing, why is symbolizing something presentation and not representation?
It's not a representation. At a simple level, it's not a representation simply because it's not, I mean, to put it in algebraic terms or geometrical, it's not graphable. It cannot be represented or imagined. It can't be confined to an image. I mean, this is why...
is this why pi is always inconsistent?
Yeah.
Necessarily. Because it goes on infinitely long, you can't give it a proper count.
Actually, if I can interject and perhaps qualify what you're saying, it's not that mathematics is presentable or representable. Some mathematics is representable.
Right.
And so it's not that mathematics qua just general science is not representable.
Right.
I mean, plenty of our science is representable. Plenty of our mathematical formulas are representable. But at its core, unlike, say, well, actually, this is bad because of the truth procedures. But say, unlike our everyday existence, right, which is a representation, those things actually, pure ontology has the possibility of pure presentation, right? Whereas,
and especially if you're thinking specifically of set theory. I mean, as Plato says, if we're going to think of multiples of multiples of multiples that proliferate to infinity, you can't think that. It's unimaginable.
Yeah.
And so that is what we mean. But it can be symbolically rendered.
Right. So
when you say symbolically rendered, I'm thinking represented.
But only in
let's-
symbols.
let's-
It can't be thought except in symbols.
Let's make this
But
distinction.
isn't that a representation? I don't understand.
this
how
is
it's not
I mean, this is a mistake and mystification that has I mean, sorry, I hope that's not
No,
hurtful.
somebody
But
calling me.
this is a mistaken mystification that has been perpetrated by people throughout the entire history of philosophy and throughout the entire world. And in fact, I mean, let's lay some blame where it's due. Plato himself is to blame for this misrepresentation that the written word is itself a representation.
Right.
And that's...
Derrida's of grammatology is crucial in this
Right.
point, as Badiou argues.
Yeah,
Plato sort of drags the point home himself.
yeah, no, I
Meaning that what Derrida argues in of grammatology is that writing is before vocal, before the logos, rather than vice versa. Whereas we think of writing as a kind of mechanical transcription of something that's more foundational, namely the spoken word.